The air clung to Margot's skin like a second layer, thick and damp with the weight of a July night that refused to cool. She stood in the spare room of her cramped apartment, the only light a faint amber glow seeping through the blinds from a street lamp outside. It was past 10, the hour when the city hummed low and restless, and she was late. Late for the cosplay event she'd spent weeks dreaming up. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the sleek fabric of the Spider-Woman suit over her hips, the material cool and taut against her skin, hugging every curve like it had been poured over her. At 18, Margot carried a daring edge, a flicker of rebellion that pulsed beneath her pale skin, urging her to test boundaries she hadn't yet named. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the kind of scent that settled into places rarely touched. She'd claimed this corner tonight, a makeshift sanctuary of scattered fabric scraps and half-finished props, because the living room was occupied. Malik sprawled across the couch out there, a friend of a friend who'd needed a place to crash. She hadn't thought much of it when she'd agreed, hadn't considered how the space would shrink with him in it. Now, alone with the hum of the city beyond the walls, she felt the weight of her own solitude shift, as if the air itself anticipated something she couldn't yet see. She stepped back, bare feet brushing the worn rug, and caught her reflection in the smudged mirror propped against the wall. The suit was a marvel, red and blue stretching over her slender frame, accentuating the dip of her waist, the slight swell of her chest. She twisted, testing the fit, and the fabric pulled tight, a delicious pressure that made her aware of every inch of herself. Her white blonde hair spilled loose over her shoulders, a stark contrast to the costume's bold lines, and she reached for the mask, fingers brushing its edge, when the door creaked. Her heart lurched. She spun, the motion too quick, and there he was. Malik, filling the doorway like a shadow carved from the night itself. At 25, he carried a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from his broad shoulders, his dark skin catching the faint light in a way that made her eyes linger. He'd been out there all evening, a presence she'd barely registered beyond the occasional low laugh or the clink of a glass. Now he was here, uninvited, his gaze locking onto her with an intensity that pinned her in place. She froze, one hand still clutching the mask, the other hovering near her thigh where the suit hadn't fully settled. The fabric gaped slightly at her side, exposing a sliver of skin, a vulnerability she hadn't meant to offer. Her breath caught in her throat, sharp and shallow, as his eyes traced her, slow and deliberate. There was no apology in his stance, no retreat, just a stillness that felt like a dare. The humidity pressed harder, the air between them thickening until it buzzed against her skin. He stepped forward, just one step, but it was enough to shrink the room. Her pulse hammered, a wild rhythm she couldn't tame, and she felt the heat of him even from a distance, the kind of warmth that promised to unravel her if she let it. She should have moved, should have tugged the suit into place, or told him to leave, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot by a pull she didn't want to name. His hand lifted, hesitant at first, then steady, and his fingers grazed her arm. Just the barest touch, a whisper of calloused skin against hers. It was electric. A jolt shot through her, racing down her spine, pooling low in her belly, where it twisted into something molten. Her lips parted, a soundless gasp as the sensation lingered, branding itself into her awareness. She felt the costume's edge against her ribs, the way it clung and shifted with her quickening breath, but it was nothing compared to the heat of that fleeting contact. Her skin prickled, alive and greedy, and she hated how much she wanted it to happen again, hated the way her mind spun with the forbidden weight of it. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this, not seeing her half-dressed, half-transformed, caught between who she was and who she wanted to become. The thought twisted inside her, sharp and thrilling, because it wasn't just the surprise of him, it was the way he looked at her, like he saw past the costume, past the bravado, into the raw, trembling core she kept hidden. Her chest tightened, a mix of fear and longing, and she felt the air shift as he lingered, close enough now that she could smell him, something earthy, warm, faintly spiced. Her thoughts fractured. She was 18, reckless, teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. And he was older, steady, a stranger who'd stumbled into her orbit with no warning. The mask slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud, and she didn't bend to pick it up. Her arm tingled where he'd touched her, the memory of it sinking deeper, and she wondered, wildly, dangerously, what it would feel like if he didn't stop there. The room pulsed with summer's heat, with her own racing blood, and she stood there, exposed and aching, as desire coiled tight within her, a thread pulled taut, ready to snap. The room was a haze of shadow and heat, the amber glow from the blinds smearing into a soft blur that barely reached the edges of Margot's vision. Her restraint, that fragile thread she'd clung to since Malek's touch seared her arm, snapped like dry tinder under flame. He stood too close now, his breath a faint rhythm in the humid air, and every line she'd drawn, every whispered rule about who she was, who he could be, dissolved into the thick, electric silence between them. She didn't think, didn't let herself think. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, a bold, reckless surge that pressed her against him, the Spider-Woman suit, a flimsy shield against the fire licking beneath her skin. The contact was immediate, overwhelming. Her chest met his, the costume's taut fabric stretching as it grazed the solid warmth of him, and a shudder rippled through her, raw and unbidden. His hands found her waist, fingers splaying wide, possessive yet slow, as if testing the shape of her through the thin layer that separated them. She felt the heat of his palms bleed into her, sinking past the surface, and her breath hitched, a sharp, jagged sound she couldn't swallow. The air crackled, alive with their shared pulse, and she tilted her head back, eyes catching the glint of his, dark, fathomless, pulling her in like gravity she couldn't fight. Her frame yielded, softening against him, the costume shifting with every shallow inhale, every tremble she couldn't hide. His touch slid upward, tracing the curve of her ribs, the dip beneath her shoulder blades, mapping her body with a deliberate care that made her dizzy. The fabric clung to her, damp now, with the sweat beading along her spine, and she felt every inch of it, the way it hugged her thighs, the way it pulled tight across her chest, heightening her awareness of where his hands roamed. Her skin burned beneath his fingers, a wildfire spreading from each point of contact, and she arched into it, chasing the sensation as it coiled low and tight in her belly. Her mind splintered, thoughts fracturing under the weight of it all. Pleasure surged, sharp and liquid, flooding her senses until she couldn't tell where she ended. And he began. His breath brushed her neck, warm and uneven, and she felt the faint scrape of his jaw against her collarbone, a roughness that sent a shiver racing down her spine. She was exposed, stripped bare, in a way the costume couldn't conceal, and yet the vulnerability thrilled her, a forbidden edge that sharpened every touch. Her hands found his shoulders, fingers digging into the muscle there, and she marveled at the contrast. His strength, her surrender, the way they fit together, like pieces she hadn't known were missing. The room seemed to pulse, the heat of July wrapping around them, amplifying the rhythm of their closeness. His hand slipped lower, cupping her hips, pulling her flush against him, and a soft sound escaped her. A gasp. A plea. She couldn't tell. The costume rode up slightly, the hem catching on her thighs, and the sudden brush of his skin against hers, unfiltered by fabric, ignited a spark that flared bright and hot. Her legs trembled, knees weakening as she leaned into him, letting his frame hold her up. The air was thick with their mingled scents, his earthy warmth, her faint lavender, and it drowned her, pulling her deeper into the moment. She felt the shift before she could name it, a raw bond forging in the heat of their tangled limbs. It wasn't just the physical, the press of his chest, the slide of his hands. It was something unspoken, a current that flowed beneath the surface, binding her to him in a way that scared her and thrilled her all at once. Her thoughts spun, wild and unmoored. She was 18, reckless, teetering on the edge of a self she didn't yet know. And he was steady, older, a force that anchored her even as he set her ablaze. The intensity of it, pleasure, exposure, connection, cracked her open, spilling everything she'd kept locked away. Her body moved with his, a rhythm she hadn't learned but somehow knew, and the world narrowed to this: the heat of his touch, the ache building inside her, the way her pulse echoed his. The costume, once a symbol of her daring, felt like nothing now, just a fragile shell she'd outgrown in the space of a heartbeat. She surrendered fully, letting the tide of it carry her, and the sensation was transformative, redefining her in the quiet gasps, the trembling limbs, the unspoken shift that tethered her to him. The room faded, the city's hum a distant murmur, and all that remained was this moment, this man, this fire that lingered in her bones, promising to stay long after the night burned out.